Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Oh, that's better. That's better. I'm Mario Gooden, Vice President for Architecture of the Architectural League of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our first lectures for the 2020 Emerging Voices series. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd just like to say that the Emerging Voices is generously supported by Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown. The Emerging Voices program is also supported by the Next Generation Fund of the Architectural League, and Architectural League programs are additionally supported in part by funds provided by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of Governor Andrew M. Cuomo and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council as well as the League's members. I'd also like to thank the Architects newspaper for another year of thoughtful coverage of the Emerging Voices series, and I encourage each of you this evening, if you haven't already, to pick up a free copy tonight. Our first presentation is by Brooklyn-based designer Olalekan Jeyifous. Lake, as he is affectionately known, Lake's multidisciplinary practice explores notions of place, positioning the concept as continuously constructed rather than given or imagined. Using borrowed or invented narratives, Lake examines architecture's relationship to community and environment through speculative proposals that raise critical questions and open new channels of dialogue. His work spans a diverse range of media, including hand-drawn sketches, technical illustrations, photo montage, animation, public sculpture, and virtual reality experiences. Lake earned his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Cornell University, and his work has been exhibited numerous places, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Museum of Modern Art, the Vitra Design Museum, and the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao. Finally, Lake's work seeks not only to represent possible futures, but it also opens our eyes and it signifies a rupture that produces a reality that is simultaneously not yet there, but is in fact already there. As recognized by this year's jury, Lake's work is truly visionary. Please join me in welcoming Lake Jeyifous.
All right, thank you very much, Mario, and of course, thank you to the Architecture League and all of you for coming out here tonight. Let's see. So I'm going to be discussing my practice, which, as Mario mentioned, is a multidisciplinary one. I create speculative, imaginative, sort of dystopian, heterotopian worlds on one hand, and then I have a public art practice on the other hand, public art installation. I did attend architectural school, so though I'm primarily practicing as a visual artist, architecture informs everything that I do. So, Speculative Futures. This project, Shanty Megastructures of Lagos, Nigeria, is a project that I've been working on since about 2012. So it's pretty much kind of the longest ongoing project. It first began as an actual sort of AIA skyscraper competition. I was looking at the third mainland bridge in Lagos. It's affectionately referred to as the go slow, because the traffic is insanely nightmarish. So I was imagining it as a sort of point of arrival and destination in terms of it, rather than it connecting Lagos Island to the mainland. And so I was imagining just a series of sort of really organic, weaving walkways, skyways, and then programming them in particular ways. It was also, in the beginning, a project that was about sustainability and looking at informal settlements throughout Lagos, slum settlements, and the idea of sort of really looking at a lot of the kind of sustainability practices that occur both as a function of ingenuity, but also just as a necessity as well. And I was also really looking at the sort of construction typologies of these sort of informal settlements. But then I became more of an artist, right? And so I wanted to circumvent the sort of critical rigor of the architectural practice in my artwork, and it became much more about sort of science fiction and about extending visibility to these communities. And Lagos, Nigeria is one of the largest growing cities in the world. Its population, I believe right now, is 25 million, and 60 to 70% of the people who live in Lagos live in informal settlements and slums. But of course, as with most places, the majority of development really focuses on these communities. So on the one hand, at best, these communities are completely ignored, and at worst, they're being bulldozed at moment's notice, a day's notice. And so I really wanted to sort of, again, extend visibility to these communities in a sort of futuristic reimagining of Lagos and reimagining of these kind of informal building typologies at a sort of large, colossal scale that you normally see your office towers and your luxury apartments. And of course, this is endemic to Lagos itself. I always like to show pictures of, this is Ida B. Wells' public housing project in Chicago. So this occurs all over the world. Marginalized communities routinely displaced, new mixed income housing built for, with ridiculous amount of, stipulations for who can live there and the like. And so you have huge communities being displaced. And so then I created the sort of first set of images for the Shanty Megastructures project. And these were a series of photo montages that were exhibited at the Shenzhen Biennial in 2015, I believe. And there were 6 of these images showing, the idea that these communities are sort of growing and evolving organically. And you may not be familiar with Lagos, but I tried to position them in sites of, privileged real estate throughout the city. And so this is Falomo Roundabout. Interestingly enough, I'm gonna risk the clicker here, or the laser. This past October, I did a viewing underneath the bridge, which is really exciting. I have a couple pictures of that. So again, it was really about, extending visibility through this sort of very future, this kind of future vision. It was also about creating outside of a sort of the kind of Western modern architecture that predominates a lot of sub-Saharan African cities and is sort of established as the national vernacular for a lot of these cities post-colonial. So I kind of wanted to play around with moving away from that sort of architecture. And these are really just digitally collaged photo montages. So they're from photographs I've taken throughout Lagos and South Africa, and it's blended with 3D computer models. So with the exception of the folks on the canoes and navigating, through the canal and a couple of those buildings, the rest of it is architectural 3D models. This is a still from a video I created as well. So the kind of antithesis of this project is the Eko Atlantic project in Lagos, Nigeria, and that is a huge, huge development, luxury development. It's sometimes referred to as the Dubai of Lagos, and it was originally begun out of a study looking at kind of the issues of environmental impact on Lagos, which is a lagoon, and land erosion. And so they got like a 20-year, 30-year, 50-year study by some serious environmentalists. But then they decided to pay for those fixes, solutions, that they would sell the land and raise money. So it became this weird feedback loop of creating more of a problem to pay for the solutions to take care of the problems. But anyway, they had this promotional video on YouTube. And so I downloaded the video, and they had like 2 or 3 second outtakes. And in those outtakes, I CGI'd my shanty megastructures into it, and then made my own promotional video for shanty megastructures and re-uploaded it back to YouTube with a lot of the same like geo-tagging and tag words. So when people would do that search, they would see this completely fictional shanty megastructure space. So as I mentioned, this project is an ongoing project rooted in my love of science fiction. And I always love science fiction as a kind of vehicle for exploring contemporary issues, particularly in film and literature, because the one thing I notice is that science fiction attempts to address or solve a particular issue in kind of 1 or 2 ways, either really exacerbating it, like that, what was that movie, Idiocracy, that we kind of like now find ourselves sort of in the midst, or they solve a particular issue, but it's some kind of deep, great sacrifice, right? Like you can no longer wear anything but monotone clothing, or you can't have emotions, or, you know, human beings are being eaten. So the next phase of this was the African Mobilities, Mad Horse City. And this was a workshop and exhibit, and it's a traveling exhibit. It's curated by Dr. Mpo Matsipa, South African woman. And for her, it was important that the work that was in the exhibit, particularly looking at the continents, did one of two things. The first is that it was shown on the continents to people from Africa, because a lot of times the sort of paternal work that we do is shown here and not there. And so it was important for her, it was important, that it was shown on the continent. So it's a series of workshops, and I was in the Lagos workshop. And then the second thing is that the subtitle of the African Mobilities is "This is not another refugee exhibit." So she really wanted to challenge, again, the kind of the way in the popular imagination people imagine architecture designs, fashion designs, relationship to the continents, which is, let me build a school, let me build a hospital for the poor kids, let me, let me do this, and so it was really about kind of expanding pedagogy around that and really inventive and creative works. And as I mentioned, showing the work in Lagos, Nigeria. And so, so this was, you saw that top view, Falomo Roundabout, and so this was underneath the bridge. This was in October. And so we had a public screening, which was really exciting because there wasn't any, really any press about it. They just had set up a huge screen with huge speakers, and then people just on the street started kind of showing up. Kids started showing up. I created VR for the Shanty megastructure, so you could really get inside of it, and you can get a clear sense of like the enormity of it and the scale. So they were having fun just, looking around the world, and it was a very kind of exciting thing for me to see my work being shared in this way. I gave a lecture of Shanty megastructures at the University of Lagos, as part of putting the work in front of an African audience if I'm creating work that confronts or addresses Africa. And I got eviscerated in the lecture. Completely eviscerated. I know one student, she was so mad, she was visibly shaking and was asking me, why am I creating ruin porn for the consumption of Western media? And so there was a whole conversation about you're putting forth the worst of us, you're using the poor communities as a kind of vehicle for this, rambling architecture that who knows what's going on. And that was the very first question when I was done with my lecture. And the entire room erupted in applause. And so I was like, okay. But I kind of like those kind of situations. So then another student stood up and said, because a lot of students had been asking me, what does Makoko Village look like? What does, because we did a tour through it and met some of the residents. And so the next student stood up and said, we're asking someone who left Nigeria 30 years ago, you know what I mean? And we live 4 blocks away from Makoko, but yet we don't know. So we need to interrogate why this is a disgusting eyesore to you, why, glass, steel, Western architecture sort of confers validity on, a sort of sustainable, successful architecture. And then he got like half applause, half of the room, but it created a very spirited and interesting debate. As part of that, Mad Horse City then was a collaboration between myself and a young writer, Wale Lawal. And so as part of the project, he wanted me to collaborate with someone from Lagos. And so he came up with three narratives, and I animated them. And so these are just a series of scenes. I wanted to stay away from video because it can sometimes get a little hairy. But the first first story is offline. And so in this world, there's a place in Nigeria, a market called Computer Village, where you can go and get anything, any kind of electronic item, whatever. So it's loosely based on Computer Village. In this world, you have to be online. You're taxed and fined if you're not. But then through the back of Computer Village is this sort of little space you can get away, and you can completely log off, and you don a kind of gas mask filled with psychedelic drugs, and then you get lost in kind of this world, right? So, and this collaboration was exciting because I just framed what Shanty Megastructures was about. First, it was about the architecture, but I was like, I want to really get inside this world and examine, what this world looks like, like how the characters live, how they exist, what they go through, what some of the small vignettes and stories might be. And then after I, told him about the world, I just let him do his thing. I didn't really give him any other direction. So whatever he gave me, to the best of my ability, I further created a world and then animated it. These are about 5 minutes long. The second one is Ominira, which means freedom in Yoruba. And so he created a further marginalized world outside of Shanty Megastructures. Now, the Shanty Megastructures is the prevailing architecture in the sort of prevailing world. And so this is a fishing village on stilts with shipping containers in various configurations. And while there is a measure of sustainability within this world, sort of these interesting aquaponics farms, waste reuse, processing, water filtration, in this world there's a kind of lack of access to protein, and all the fisheries are privatized by the Eko Atlantic group. And so the story is about a father and his daughter canoeing through it, kind of breaking a fence into these illegal fisheries and what happens. And so here are just, kind of some of those scenes. And, after I got eviscerated in that lecture, I thought he might kind of develop an uplifting story, at least one of the 3, but none of them were. He just went darker and darker. But it was very fun to create the kind of architecture around it and then begin to really think of what this world looks like and how it's inhabited. And the last one is Dreamscape. And so in Dreamscape, every individual, so Dreamscape focuses on a laborer for a private multinational industrial corporate firm operating in Lagos. And due to kind of global scarcity, everyone is sort of euthanized at a certain point around 20 years old or something. And they work 20 hours a day, what have you. But the one thing they're given is an AI system in their single room their SRO, called Dreamscape. And in Dreamscape, you can pretty much choose anywhere you want to go to, any world you want to visit, and completely live in that world. So all of your joy and happiness comes out of how you escape from the sort of rigorous, constant working every day. And so this is focused on a character in his last 7 minutes of life and kind of where he wanted to go. And then so this is a view of kind of the last shot. He chooses Mars and has, from the book of Genesis, read in Yoruba. So there's a scene he's kind of flying through Mars, and then it cuts back to, this is inside a shanty megastructure space, cuts back to this scene, and then kind of meanders and flows up and out before he dies. And so the next iteration of this project then is the Anarchonauts of Chat SMS 2125. And so my, my kind of ideological governing system for the shanty megastructures is the chat system, which stands for chaotic anarchic technocracy. So I really started playing around and making these characters, sort of combining the informal economy of Lagos, which is very much market-driven, as well, again, the ideas around sort of like sustainability and emergent technology and sort of salvaging experts, and really going through and looking at these characters and how they're selling fuel or have different water filtration systems, or just how they're managing to exist within a sort of realm of kind of global scarcity. And so these are just a series of, pretty large scale black and white digital collages. A lot of these photographs, again, either I took or a good friend of mine, Emmanuel Pratt, took on his trips throughout Mozambique in South Africa and the like. And again, just really the sort of combining of, sci-fi from a kind of West African view. So one of the things I'm, really inspired by is kind of like steampunk, but imagining if steampunk is outside the realm of a kind of Western presentation. So I have, again, all of these characters as well as these sort of vehicles. The idea that everything is sort of mobile, and it's this kind of like cycle of reusing different materials, and sort of thinking about ideas around communication. So I have a solo exhibit coming up later this year, and so the future, heavily more of this work. So that's the speculative stuff. The public art stuff now I kind of shift into the public art realm, and so I'll take you through a few of my public art projects. The first is, along with a very good friend, mentor, colleague, Amanda Williams, who shares a similar trajectory as mine. She went to Cornell University, and she's moved more into being a visual artist, but just like myself, her practice is heavily informed by her architectural background, particularly our architectural education. I usually lead with my thesis when I give talks, because I'm pretty much just doing my thesis over and over again and calling it my art. And Amanda's very similar. Her thesis is very much what she's doing now. But anyway, long story short, we were awarded the commission for Shirley Chisholm. And it'll be the first monument dedicated to a woman in Brooklyn. It's going to be located at the southern end of Park Slope in the entrance. And so I'll take you through a little bit of kind of our thinking and our process of how we really came up with our design. So Shirley Chisholm was running for president, I believe 1972, right? And it was audacious then, and absurdly so. It's still audacious now. But really what she was interested in, very much what her kind of ideological belief was that the democratic political process in this country should be one that everyone should have access to, everyone should want to participate in, and should feel welcome in participating in this process. And so, you know, when you do a kind of online search for her, you see a lot of these portraits with her with the Capitol building in the background framing her. But we really wanted to invert that relationship and have her framing the Capitol building, right? The idea that now she is sort of larger than life. She was small in stature, but again, her ideas were audacious at the time, and again, still now. And so, you know, we created a series of profiles, and also really thinking of the kind of architectural language of the Garden Gate, because this is an entryway into Prospect Park. It is, you know, it is a threshold. And so we created, you know, these 3 different profiles because it's a very interesting corner where this project is going to be located. There's multiple approaches from many different angles, so we really wanted to create a different condition and experience and kind of viewership as you approach either from Ocean Ave, Parkside Ave, or getting up off of the train. Another thing, she was a census taker, so she literally was pounding the pavements of Brooklyn, knocking on every door, really trying to invite people into this political process. So we translated the idea of kind of walking or marching into this gate, this sort of abstracted gate that would go on the perimeter. So we used the sort of seat of Congress for our way of kind of working with the ground plane. And I'll kind of show you how it builds up. So we reverse extruded it into the ground and then began to create layers. And so this amphitheater is more of a visual experience. This isn't like at the scale of sitting, you know what I mean? It's more kind of this sort of kind of sacred antechamber where we would have markers that would be dedicated to other women who had sort of joined this political process. So we have these inscribed recognition markers. And then there's that perimeter fence dedicated to walking and marching, as I mentioned earlier. And then so there's that primary sculptural profile, which is Shirley Chisholm, you know, kind of consuming the Capitol building. And then the second one is the outline of her profile with sort of vegetation. And at this point, as a proposal, it was just more generic, but our idea is sort of really to reflect some of the vegetation that exists at the park. And then the third one is rotating it a little bit and creating a kind of like threshold support. And so this is what it would look like in an aerial view. And so you kind of get a sense of how it works in relationship to the site in the park. And again, these are different vantage points. So this would be approaching from Ocean Avenue, the southern approach from Ocean Avenue. And so you get a little bit of her profile, but you're really not sure quite what you're seeing. And from this vantage point coming from the western edge of the Parkside Avenue, it looks more like this sort of, you know, vegetation, sort of ivy profile view here. And then this is coming down Ocean Avenue where you get a clear line of visual of who, you know, who is being honored here. And we call this one a croissant view. You know, when you're working so close to a project and you haven't stepped back and, you know, we didn't notice that we'd created a croissant out of her hair, which everyone was referring to. So that's something, you know, there's design adjustments that are impending. We actually have our first meeting next week, but that was pretty funny because that was what all the panel and everyone was calling it, the croissant view. And then so this is coming out of the park, then approaching that corner. And then this would be what that sort of like chamber-like experience would be, right? And so again, you can kind of sit on it, but you know, it's not really, it's more about these kind of particular recognition markers. and then one of her quotes there inlaid into the ground. And of course, the night view. And so I'm going to give you a little tip if you ever find yourself pitching for a public art project. You will likely be the only person that does a night view, because no other artist ever thinks of it, but people are coming up out of this subway after 6, 7 p.m., the majority of the time, this is how it's gonna be seen. So I remember telling Amanda, I was like, Amanda, we gotta do a night view, because watch, they're gonna say no one else did one. And they did, and oh, you guys did a night view, oh. So remember that. I'm serious. The Boom and the Bust. This is a project that I completed just this past year in Grand Rapids, Michigan, for Art Prize. And it was the inaugural exhibit, Project One. And so they wanted to have a series of kind of thematic, thematic presentations each year throughout Grand Rapids. And so this year's was Cross Lines. And so I began just looking at redlining in the city of Grand Rapids. And as you know, redlining is the practice of, denying loans to individuals from Black communities, or denying any kind of resources, or on the other end of redlining, charging exorbitant interest rates. So I was sort of looking at kind of the history of redlining in Grand Rapids and how it has transformed these Black communities and neighborhoods. So these were first a series of different outdoor installation studies. I was thinking of kind of using that map to excavate out of the homes. The sites for each of these were all over Grand Rapids. So at the time, this was going to be in, I believe, Martin Luther King Park. So this is sort of the way I was looking at it. And so I did all these different variations, of how you could then kind of go into that, go into the space and sort of look at how it's, kind of carved out the home. There's a huge issue with foreclosures and a kind of housing crisis. And so this is a rendering I did. But then they switched my site and put me downtown, right across from the Grand Rapids Art Museum. And so it completely changed to this, downtown city center. So I started thinking of things more in a kind of visual scale. So some of the issues I was thinking about, I call this project The Boom and the Bust, because there are sort of two narratives occurring in Grand Rapids and everywhere in the US. On the one hand, there's an enormous amount of economic boom. There's an enormous amount of development going on downtown. There's all these breweries popping up simultaneously for a lot of the Black and Hispanic communities. There's an incredible amount of foreclosure. There are houses available, but they're being bought by out-of-state real estate companies, and the prices are being driven up. So there's a huge issue. There's a simultaneous narratives going on. And so I wanted to combine those narratives. One of them was some ridiculous percentage of individuals are living out of their cars. So I wanted to have this kind of large, triumphant, sort of brutalist downtown sculpture being built. And then this was the next iteration of that. I wanted to really fine-tune the message, and so that was the design I went with. And so here are a couple fabrication drawings. It was fabricated by a firm in St. Louis called Huft. And then, so it kind of shows how this thing would go together. And then here it is sort of being built. So it's 25 feet tall, and it is this sort of, the idea is this very large development, and it is kind of, I wanted to use a sort of raw construction material language. When you're downtown, what really signifies economic boom are all the cranes and all the sidewalk sheds you see going up, right? And so that kind of, there's a lot happening. So I wanted to have it be very sort of raw, but then simultaneously bisected through the sort of steel, steel frame, steel girder frame, with a series of these small scale model homes Of course, red often, denotes a negative statistic. So I had it really kind of separated out and kind of housing these homes. And again, the idea being the boom and the bust. So this sort of combined narrative occurring. Made with Love is a project that I just completed. It was just installed a few months ago. It is the 8th Avenue stop in Brooklyn, in Chinatown. And so I wanted to create a mashup of sort of the local architecture, local urban vernacular with the foods and the cuisines. Sunset Park area, Brooklyn is a very multi-ethnic neighborhood known for a variety of different cuisines. And so I wanted to reimagine them through sort of, again, the kind of local architecture, everyday street elements, magazine racks or fences or fur. We have, it's also near Coney Island, we have a bagel as a life preserver, and then a blanket as like whatever, locks or something. And so this is kind of a very fun, exciting project to work on, because I got to create all of these different, all these different visuals and experiences. And so it is on 2 platforms, northbound platform, southbound platform, and it is 15 glass murals on each end. So it's really like this very long, kind of full gallery of these sort of mashups. And so here's some early non-professional photographs. This is me just going out there to visit it. So there's a lasagna made with love. You see a lot of the row homes. You see a lot of flags. You see a lot of the telephone poles sort of standing for that stringy lasagna. Cheese is, the kind of telephone wires connecting. So very kind of whimsical, fun, playful way of playing around with the architecture and the different sort of cuisines reflected in this community. You have the Italian icy cart, and the cart is replaced with just a bodega, your classic corner building. You have borscht with the Russian matryoshka dolls, with various scales, descending scales of buildings, and hot dog stands with bits of mailbox and newspaper kiosk floating in it. And you have the fruit stand selling fire hydrants and mailboxes and satellites and telephone poles and parking meters. This was a very fun project to work on. And so I was really excited to kind of see it go up. And then, of course, you have, skewers of, again, the same thing, the ubiquitous New York manhole covers. And I used a German firm called Glassmalerei Peters. They are in, drawing a blank. But anyway, they're in northern Germany. And I selected them, even though there was a glass, fabricator like right here in Brooklyn, because they had this very interesting process of how they got the color down. So it was a kind of stencil process. Then it was fired. And so the kind of imperfections and bubbles and inconsistencies I felt gave a little bit more texture, because I was working on these files digitally, so I wanted it to have a sort of artisan quality to it. And again, you have the chicken parm with the Subway, and a plate of telephone pole fries. So this project is in Durham, North Carolina. And it's called the Smart Vision Plan. So it's a plan to revitalize the downtown area. And the idea is to combine the 3 distinct zones. You have the American Tobacco area, which is the historic area. And then you have the the Center City area, where there's a lot of development. Duke Labs is there, innovation, et cetera. And then the 3rd district is the Central Park District, where it's more sort of family-oriented, community-based, and kind of local artisans and metal workers. So my approach was to distill the sort of architectural typology of those distinct zones into very simple isometric illustrations. so that I could use those as kind of building pieces to create this extreme landscape mural, which was on which is on the Corcoran Garage, which expands a full block. As part of that practice, this was my design. As part of that, I did a series of community engagements where I would just go I spoke to Duke art students, the Hilliard High School students, and individuals from the senior center. And so just asked them kind of what resonated about Durham, North Carolina for them, just to get a little bit more feedback to kind of add some more detail, some specific recognizable detail that would resonate with the local community. And so here you see the kind of scale of it. And so I got some really great feedback. I met with, Durham was kind of a kind of important space in kind of the civil rights movements. Pauli Murray's from there, poet, lawyer. And so I visited the Pauli Murray home. Her uncle ran one of the first black brick making companies, and so I was able to then, the bricks had this very interesting kind of spiral pattern on it, so I tried to bring back very specific elements. The young students, Durham is known as Bull City, so I was like, how can we work in the bull without the ubiquitous actual bull? Because even across the street, there's like 2 huge signs of bulls, And so they were like, the horn symbol is something that, we kind of do. So I was able to add that in. And so people walk by, like, oh, there's a horn. So it felt kind of personal, felt kind of related and connected. And so here is an aerial of it. And so again, you can really get a sense of kind of like that large scale. Protest was a project I did in 2017. It is in Cleveland Public Square. Cleveland Public Square has a long and storied history as a site of demonstration, government-sanctioned demonstration. You can go there and protest various things without fear of reprisals. And so you have the protest against ICE, Tamir Rice, who was killed by the police, all the way back to Vietnam and extending back to even the civil rights era. So what I wanted to do was, again, create a series of characters, individuals engaged in various forms of protest. So I came up with 4 profile silhouettes of, a woman yelling, of various stages of that kind of public protest, demonstration, and engagement, from a nice, happy moment of reconciliation with 2 people hugging, to a kind of more, amplifying the issue with the woman yelling into the microphone, and then an individual handing out pamphlets. And so these are made out of 3/4-inch water jet cut aluminum, and they're about 10 feet tall. And so this is it on your average every day. It's actually not a bad like portmanteau. Anyway, so, people, it's downtown, people take their lunch there, so they would come and just, sit on these benches. But it was really exciting to see these sculptures get activated during a protest. So this is a March for Equality. And so I had, really, really incredible pictures showing how the, work really worked with it. I really love this picture because it's kind of really amplifying that message. It was a March for Our Lives protest, the one about, the Parkland shooting and banning assault weapons. So it was really exciting to see the artwork kind of amplify the message of what was going on down there. And then that was their temporary, so they were only installed for a year. And so the next permanent home is in front of the Langston Hughes Cleveland Public Art Library, which also is a site where Martin Luther King gave a speech. So I like that it's still sort of connected to the history, and so this is its permanent home. Inner Sanctum is a project that I did in Brooklyn, and so it is in at the bottom of a large residential building. And so I was just interested in kind of looking at the facade structure of a lot of buildings going up there. It's adjacent to Fort Greene Park, so I wanted to bring in the kind of vegetation weaving in, and then created a hanging sculpture in the center. And it was a kind of luxury building, so I wanted to create the idea of the sort of gilded cage, right? Because there's a lot of security cameras around there, and so the idea of like surveillance and private property and who owns it, who can kind of gain access. And so this is it during the day. It's more about that kind of stencil on the glass. You can see it. But at night, it is lit up. So it's the size of a retail display space, so maybe about 4 or 5 feet. So it really glows at night, and then you can kind of see, this sort of bird cage item with these CCTV screens kind of ominously perched on the ends. And so it's living in my study right now, wrapped with bubble tape. But every once in a while, it gets broken out and can find a new home for another short-term exhibition. And I actually made this in my kitchen as well, so it's kind of a fun, do-it-yourself project. And so finally, with Crown Ether sort of set me on my trajectory down this public art path, and I got very lucky that my very first public art project was like the biggest, with the biggest budget, you know what I mean? Yet, until the Shirley Chisholm. And they have their own team of fabricators. And so it works like a dream. Now I know the kind of very complicated way public art works, which is like tedious and bureaucratic, and 95% is you meetings and, preparing this and that, and only a small percent is making the art. But at the time, I was a artist in resident at the Headlands Art Center right outside of the Bay. And I had done a series of these small 9-inch by 12-inch collages called Hi-Fi de Stijl. So they're a mashup, of course, the kind of de Stijl sort of visual aesthetic, the isometric with my kind of memories of my father's audio equipment in Nigeria. And so that sort of 60 Danish designed audio hi-fi system. So I had a whole bunch of these, and the assistant curator, Rafi Lehrer, saw those collages and spoke to the main curator, Paul, and said, I think it'd be cool to turn one of those collages into a really big Coachella sculpture. And so Paul visited me and kind of gave me a very ominous, not challenge, but he said, listen, why don't you propose some things, and we'll look over it. And he said, but I just want to let you know, if we put it in front of the big man, and I still don't know who the big man is to this date, if we put it in front of the big man and he doesn't like it, it's over. And Paul has a very kind of like flat affect and deadpan, you know what I mean? So I was like, is he joking? He's like, it's over. So I gave him tons and tons, like 7, 8, 9 proposals. After a while, clearly it was just filler and nonsense, you know what I mean? But I was like, I need to get this. So this is the one we went with. It's Crown Ether, and of course I was thinking of this sort of community like existing at the top of these like trunk-like pillars. Because it is a music festival, so I was thinking of the idea, sort of the kind of predates built architecture is the tree, and it's also the site where individuals would come and gather underneath to play music, have oral history shared and passed down. So I wanted to create this kind of treehouse space where, festival goers could come and really gather. So here again, we had to figure out, all the pieces were sort of broken out. And again, Coachella has their own team of engineers and fabricators. So, I gave them the actual model. Then we had, of course, to reduce the triangulation of, the trunks to something doable, right? It wasn't too complicated. And so the buildings were built off-site. It's 50 feet tall with a footprint, 35 feet by 35 foot plinth that I had to fight for because the fire marshal didn't want there to be any sort of plinth on the ground. He said because the drunk high children will hurt themselves, and it'll be a problem. So I was like fighting to make a step. Okay, let's one step 8 inches. And there's only 3 of them. And all right, so I managed to get, convince them to give me 3 steps that 10 feet each, which I felt was really going to balance out, you know, this project, which is so top heavy. I felt if it just went into the ground, it wouldn't look right. So fabricated offsite, and you know, Coachella is only a 2-week installation. So 2 weeks out, they really start building this thing. And so it has a steel frame clad with marine ply. And then it was interesting to see them. They built all these little nooks and crannies and holes that they could climb into and kind of attach the buildings together from inside. And so there it is. And it, you know, I was like, 50 feet, that's amazing. But the space is so huge that when you get there, I was like, I should have done this 70 feet, you know, because this isn't really that impressive at all. Until then it fills back up with people, then it begins to feel large again. For me, that's always interesting, working on something on a computer, then seeing the scale of it shift. So there are a bunch of really fun Instagram photos. Now that has become a new item in making public art. Is it Instagrammable? You know, that becomes the new thing. But no, this is an exciting project. People would sit to escape the heat. It gets up to 115 degrees out in the desert. And people would also sit in the shadow. And then so this is the view of it at night. They created a whole comprehensive lighting program so they could change the light to the music, change the colors. It was just incredibly exciting to see. And then so there's, you know, kind of the view at night. And thank you very much for coming out.